I'm David Cohen, and one of the things I love doing is introducing books at Politics and Prose under the terrific leadership of Brad Graham and Lissa Muscatine and the wonderful staff here. There are a lot of reasons why I want to do this book. In introducing Aaron David Miller, we're here to celebrate the publication of Aaron's book, The End of Greatness, Why America Can't Have and Doesn't Want Another Great President. So, Aaron, first of all, welcome back to Politics and Prose. You've been here for other books, and it's wonderful to have you back here. Carla would always introduce Aaron, so I'm glad I get this chance as well. But there's another reason. Aaron Miller has been he's a public servant now. He was when he was at the State Department, now at the Wilson Center with a very nice title about Vice President for New Initiatives. But, you know, we all see him on television, we read him. He's adding to the quality of civil discourse. Some might say the bar isn't high, but Aaron raises it, and that's very good. And when I'm ebullient, he grounds me with some reality, and when I'm low, he gives me some sense of hope sometimes. The other reason is Aaron has the distinction of being the only person who stimulated my son when Aaron taught Hebrew school over 30 years ago. And that is a rare distinction. When I saw this book and knew that I wanted to do it as an amateur historian, I remembered 55 years or so ago reading James Bryce's 1888 essay on why the United States doesn't have great men as presidents. Now we would say why we don't have great people as presidents. And sure enough, Aaron references the Bryce essay in his book. And so we have here a wonderful book that deals with history, done in a nuanced way, a really great effort at understanding the present that we're in now, a serious set of chapters on the what might be called the Wavy trajectory of the Obama president, and also how to think about the future. So let us welcome Aaron David Miller to Politics and Prose again.
Thank you all. And David, it's really meaningful. I really didn't know that you were going to be here, but very fond memories of you, Aaron, and of course, Carla. And I want to thank all of you for coming. I know the Redskins are on at 1 o'clock, 3 and 5 notwithstanding. A couple of other thank yous to Lindsay Miller, who doesn't want to hear any more about this book and my annoying analysis on this or the Middle East, but thank you so much for your love and support. To my daughter, who is already a better writer than I am, and it's not false flattery, it's true, both in fiction and nonfiction. You really do inspire me. My son, Danny, whose fierce independence and relentless logic makes me think, rethink, and think again. You also inspire me, truly. The origins of this book lay not in the American story, but in the Middle Eastern story. And I began thinking about this based on 25 years of working to try to do what we could to help solve the problem of the much too promised land. And I realized both in my own contemporary experience and in history, it was only when we had leaders who were masters of their political constituencies and dominant within their own political houses that we had breakthroughs. Those who were prisoners of those political constituencies without vision, even if those opportunities were presented by someone else. In the case of Menachem Begin, for example, you had a great Egyptian leader, perhaps the greatest Arab statesman of all time, certainly in the 20th century. And from there, it began to dawn on me that history also validated to some degree the importance of great individuals in changing the human enterprise. John Keegan, the military historian, will tell you that 6 men dominated much of the 20th century, 1920 to 1950. 6. And were responsible for most of the death, destruction, devastation, and also prospects for peace, prosperity, and redemption of much of the Western world. 6 individuals. Now, you could add or subtract from the list. We could argue about who should be on that list. But never underestimate the impact of the individual at whatever level in coming to grips with the ills and the travails, both for ill and for good. Marx, not Groucho Marx, and I'll refer to Groucho in a minute, wrote in the 19th century, he was writing in the 19th century, make history, but rarely as they please. Marx, I think, understood that Carlyle's notion of the great man and or woman theory of history had to be tempered by another reality, which was circumstances. And the times in which great men and women function have to be factored into the equation, which is part of the problem that troubled and annoyed me with respect to our somewhat cartoonish cardboard character of what a leader is. So it really was only a hop, skip, and a jump from the Middle East to our global leadership deficit. The passing of Nelson Mandela, I believe, was instructive in this regard. Neruda once argued that your absence defines the horizon, which is one of his love poems. He was right. Mandela's passing left an extraordinary sense of emptiness and loss, because we live, in my judgment, in a post-heroic leadership era. 5 great powers, 5 permanent members of the Security Council. Where are the great leaders? 193 nations are represented in the United Nations. I could argue with any of you as to whether or not you could identify one leader that was transformative, transactionally competent, and good as well. Vladimir Putin and President Erdogan of Turkey are good at maintaining power, perhaps even projecting it, and maintaining their seats over a period of time, but are they transformational and good leaders? So it was only natural that I look at America and the single most important institution that drives our political system, which is the presidency. For all its ills and its imperfections, it remains incredibly vibrant, incredibly salient, and incredibly relevant to our experience. It's always in session. 535 representatives, 9 Supreme Court justices are in and out of session, not the presidency. It's much easier to relate, to criticize, to praise an individual with a prospectively heroic story, with a wife and kids and presidential pets, than it is to relate to a dysfunctional Congress and a Supreme Court that can be at times quite inscrutable. And the media, and more on this in a minute, virtually guarantees presidential visibility. Too much, I would argue. So I took a look at the president and began to understand the gap and the sense of emptiness that seems to drive what campaigning is, what you promise people, as opposed to what governing is, what it is in fact they get, either fully or partially, or not at all. And it was quite clear to me that the supply of great presidents in our history rarely, the demand for great presidents is simply well out of step with the supply. And even though we should know better, and even though I think we do know better, we continue to want and aspire to greatness in our political culture. And I'm not arguing we abandon it, that search. I'm arguing that we temper it. John King, who I interviewed for this book, came up with a great line, greatness with a small g, he said, which is the title of the final chapter, as to how you balance the realities of what any president can achieve against the circumstances and constraints. And one of the other problem here is that since we have such a low regard for our politicians, we have easily transferred great from them to our actors, our celebrities, our musicians, our entertainers. We're quite able in purchasing tickets and following our celebrity culture to imbue and invest our entertainment world with great. You can even watch West Wing, which frankly, brilliant series. Aaron Sorkin was brilliant. It's much more fun, much more entertaining, much more heroic than the real thing. And that's in part one of the reasons people gravitate toward. In one of the episodes, off camera. Jed Bartlett literally at a Camp David summit solves both Jerusalem and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Now, I was at the last Camp David summit. And the gap between the heroic notion of what we seek and revel in, Harrison Ford on Air Force One, and the realities of what presidents can actually do needs to be taken account of. I was briefing some military fellows, all combat veterans, all roughly my age a year or so ago, and I asked them, what political leader in their time would they associate American, the word great, with? And remember, we use the word great every day. I use the word great 15 times a day. He's a great tennis player. What a great movie. I had a great time. It means nothing. We have emptied it. We've emptied it of all content. And when it applies to our politics, I believe we've done that because we don't see it anymore. And it's impossible in our politics to appreciate it. So I gave them 10 minutes to solve the problem. They couldn't. So they turned to me, of all people. Who is your candidate? And the answer was so obvious to me. It was Martin Luther King. Despite all of King's imperfections, it was King. And then one of them said to me, but that's not fair. I said, why? Because he was assassinated in 1968. And I said, that's precisely the problem. The last great, undeniably great inaugural address given in this country, the last one, and remember, unlike presentations and speeches that presidents sometimes have to prepare for quickly, an inaugural reflects an enormous amount of preparation. What was the last great inaugural address ever given in this country? And I will argue with any of you who come up with any other alternative other than Kennedy's Ask Not speech, because it was grounded in persona, in reality, in the turbulence, expectations, and aspirations of the time, and it was grounded at a moment when Americans had not yet lost faith in their politicians and in the institutions of government. It is no coincidence that the two most prominent protest movements of the last decade, Occupy Wall Street and the Tea Party, are all oriented in many respects toward against big corporations, big institutions, big government. That's another problem. If government is perceived to be illegitimate, incompetent, and irrelevant, how does a president, forget whether you're using it in a big way or in a small way, how does a president define the kind of space that is required to get things done if people don't believe in our politics or in institutions? So the book's basic argument is driven by three simple, although highly arguable, propositions. And I wrote this book not to end the conversation. I mean, trust me on this. I am a trained American historian. I wrote one serious history book and a lot of other books which were not quite as serious, and they certainly weren't history books. I've applied my logic, my experience, my life experiences on leadership to try to get some thematic altitude, to get my arms around in a 280-page book the notion of greatness in the presidency. What it was, how come it's gone, and most provocatively, why we don't want it back. So the book has three arguments. Number one, greatness, and I define it very clearly. Was president present and real in our political history? Three undeniably great presidents, very rare, one a century. Washington in the 18th, Lincoln in the 19th, FDR in the 20th. Their greatness derives from many things, but from one thing in particular, which is nation-encumbering crisis. A crisis so irresistible, so inescapable, so hot that nobody can get away from it. And the founders, when they created this system, wanted an energetic executive, but one that was constrained too. So they created a system with shared and separated powers because they feared the royal governors. They feared the great man. Benjamin Rush called them a pestilence. Or no, he said they were alive. Franklin argued that they were worse than famine, hunger, and war. Even though they self-styled themselves, surely John Adams spent enormous amounts of time trying to protect his reputation. So greatness was real. It's confronting a nation-encumbering crisis that truly threatens the nation for a sustained period of time. It is extracting out of that crisis, because you are both lucky and skillful, some piece of transformative change that alters the way we look at ourselves as a people or fundamentally redefines some social, political, or economic reality, not just for an administration, but forever, in the sense as long as the country will endure. And finally, greatness means rising above the narrow partisanship that has come to characterize our politics. Lincoln and FDR were despised, hated men. And yet over time, it was clear to historians, the general public, the pundits, that these three, including Washington, were undeniably great. Point two, greatness is gone. I opened that chapter with a story from Larry David, the Passover Seder. I don't know if any of you have seen it. I actually was just speaking in Chicago, and before the talk, I was sitting down with some guy, and we were talking. He says, "Do you know who I am?" I said, "No. I'm Jeff Garland's brother." He's Larry's manager. So we talked. I gave him my card. I said, "You got to tell Jeff to buy the book because, in a way, he's in it." That chapter begins with Passover Seder. Jeff's brother-in-law, very conservative, is talking to Larry and says, "Have you ever heard of the principle of 77?" And Larry says, "No, what's that?" The guy says, "Well, every 77 years we have another great president." Larry said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Washington, Lincoln, FDR, and W." Larry, for the first time, Larry cannot respond. He didn't know what to say. And Jeff's brother says, we truly live in great times. We have now gone the longest single stretch in our history without the emergence of an undeniably great president. Cute piece of presidential trivia. It means something. It means nothing. What it means to me is that greatness in the presidency has become much harder. I deal in probabilities these days, not possibilities. And it seems to me the trend lines, 12 presidents and down and counting, including our current one, have failed. Now, that doesn't mean the presidency is a failure. It doesn't mean these men, and one day a woman, aren't competent, brilliant, committed, dedicated men. But that kind of greatness, I would argue, is gone. And it's gone for 3 or 4 reasons. Number one, what historian William Leuchtenberg called the shadow of FDR. I call it FDR's hard bar. It is virtually inconceivable to imagine another president who was elected to 4 terms, who died in office, who fought America's last good war, the last war that left this country stronger at home and more powerful abroad. There has not been a single war in our history subsequently that answers the mail on all those accounts. The Republicans in 51, when the 22nd Amendment to the Constitution was passed, restricting a president to 2 terms, this was their revenge against FDR, but they didn't realize what they were doing. What they were doing is enshrining FDR with all of his imperfections to be our last undeniably great president. No president again would ever serve more than 2 terms. Finally, he didn't fix the Depression, the war did that. But the confidence game that FDR played during those critically important years with 25% unemployment, this is not the Great Recession, with violence in American cities, with routine sights of men and women ferreting food or scraps out of garbage heaps, with great migrations according to in the Dust Bowl. This is not the Great Recession. And part of the problem is presidents have to read, they want transformative change, they got to read the real estate correctly. So that's one. Second, we haven't had another nation-encumbering crisis since the Great Depression, World War II. 12 days in October 1962, the world's on the verge of a nuclear exchange between the United States and the former Soviet Union. Jack Kennedy is president, 1,037 days of a presidency, not long enough to be judged great, handles himself extremely well, and the crisis actually prevents any additional 11th hour clashes. 9/11, intriguing notion. 9/11 might have been a moment of national transformation, maybe. I don't want to come down too heavily on George W. Bush on this. But was it a crisis that encumbered the nation? Was it a crisis that created a shared sense of mutual obligation, responsibility, and sacrifice? Absolutely not. It was the reverse. The 2 longest wars in American history are being fought to this day by 0.5% of 330 million people. No politician and no military strategist would want it any other way. There's not going to be a draft in this country. My father went to war in 1941. There were 130 million people in this country. 16 million of them put on a uniform. You can discount 40% of all of the nostalgia and the tropes and myths of the greatest generation, but make no mistake. These were nation-defining crises, and they created the possibility of having millions of Americans invested in a common enterprise. Could that have happened in the wake of 9/11? I don't know. Newtown, every time there is a seminal event that becomes nation-rendering, Ebola, ISIS, it's no longer sufficient. The country's too big. The media cacophony too distracting. The sense of national identity too diffuse. And I'm not arguing to go back to the 1940s and 50s, trust me. They were good times in many respects, but bad times in others, particularly for women, minorities, for civil rights. But the lack of a nation-encumbering crisis, we don't want it back. That's the good news. You had transformative leaders to deal with the national experiment. We survived. And we are still the most consequential power on earth because you had them. You don't want to test the proposition of greatness in the presidency, or if you do, buckle your seatbelt. Because I assure you, you are going to have a crisis so profound that the domestic politics is somehow tamed, the political elites cooperate, and the public follows. And that's only one piece of it. The crisis has to be accompanied by the two other C's, character and capacity. And crisis, character, and capacity, my RX for presidential greatness, has not realigned sufficiently since FDR. And again, imperfect men all. We can talk about all of that. They should not be turned into saints. The founders would have protested, but they were extraordinary. Extraordinary. Finally, you have the media, which ensures that visibility is vulnerability. It's hard to really understand, even for me, to see how destructive the media has been for the reputations and credibility of presidents. Nothing stays quiet. Maybe that's good in the interest of democratization and the spread of information. But de Gaulle argued you needed mystique and authority to preserve greatness. Now, I know my kids tell me I'm old, I'm 65, maybe that's part of the problem. Barack Obama gives a Twitter conference in June of 2011. That's smart politics. Barack Obama goes on Jay Leno, and they get into a conversation about sports. The president said, in this late-night banner, I bowled a 139. It's good enough for the Special Olympics. The next day, he finds himself apologizing to Tim Shriver. It's arguable whether or not you can go on Jon Stewart or Jay Leno and emerge. You're changed, and the image of you is changed. Now, maybe that's okay. Maybe it's okay. But the fishbowl in which presidents live, in which they project themselves. Michael Beschloss tells us that when Kennedy addressed the nation on October 22nd, 1962, I was 12. I probably didn't watch the speech. My parents watched it. And you know what? The networks, after the speech addressing the most severe crisis in the nation's history, the networks went back to normal programming. There was no 24-hour buildup with digital clocks ticking down the time to the president's address. There were not three banks of CNN, MSNBC, Fox analysts, all with computers, mediating. My parents had to look at John Kennedy, make a judgment for themselves about whether he made sense or not. That no longer exists. The president's voice has become one voice among many. And that's hard, and it's inevitable. The last, I don't know how many presidents have been incredible specimens. The last bald president was Dwight Eisenhower. Adlai Stevenson and Dwight Eisenhower ran against one another. You will not see that again. You will see well-follicled, fit presidents, because it can be no other way, in my view, unless truly you have some rearranging of the furniture which allows such a political talent to emerge. FDR might not have been able to be president had the public seen the humiliating positions with which he had to assume to be carried in and out of doors, through windows, and upstairs. He accepted the Democratic nomination at Franklin Field, outside of Philadelphia. 100,000 people were there. He drove in, sitting on the back of an open-air convertible. Secret Service helped him out of the car. He's going up to the podium, and he turns to say hello to Edwin Markham, an aging American poet. And as he turns to make his way, his right brace buckles. And his son James and Bill O'Reilly of the Secret Service tried to support him. The 100,000 probably didn't see the President of the United States fall with the speech text fluttering all around. But the media did. The radio guys did. Not a word of that was reported the next day. So in that respect, it's really hard to maintain this kind of standard. And finally, why don't we want great presidents back again? I mean, I admit it's counterintuitive. I admit it's provocative. It's driven by one basic conclusion. Greatness is too rare to be relevant in our politics, too rare to be relevant, and too dangerous, in my judgment, to be desirable. Too rare to be relevant, too dangerous to be desirable. Doesn't mean that we can't have presidents who do great things. The last 50 years have demonstrated acts of greatness in the presidency. But if you're looking in this day and age and in this presidency for the kinds of the one to rescue, to redeem, to save, when Barack Obama rolls into Washington, recreating part of Lincoln's journey by train from Philadelphia, when he's sworn in on Lincoln's Bible, when he recreates, served on Mary Todd Lincoln's china, the exact same meal that Lincoln consumed at his inaugural meal, including the sour cherry chutney, you begin to create a frame of reference which is really hard to meet. When you talk about becoming a partisan president in the most shark-infested waters, if Norm Ornstein was here, he would agree. How do you look at the real estate? Of course he wanted greatness. He was faced with the worst economic recessions, the Great Depression, the two longest wars in American history. But aspirations have to be met with strategies and a reading of the real estate, because it is the real estate more than anything else that create the opportunities for effective, let alone greatness in the presidency. We have a cartoonish image. Great person is elected with good win, brilliant, looks good, brilliant rhetorician, gives speeches, creates narrative, opposition melts away, supporters rally, and transformative change happens in America. Jack Kennedy, who knew better, loved this line from Henry IV, Act 3. Glendower says to Hotspur, I can summon the spirits from the vasty deep. Hotspur turns to him and says, but so can any man. The question is, do they come when you call? Do they come when you call? And that means leadership means followership, which I don't have enough time to talk about, but a leader without followers is just a man or a lady out for a walk. And that sense of followership is really, really important, and to a large extent it's missing. My conclusion, and last chapters always disappoint. My friend David Greenberg wrote a piece on this for the New York Times. Any of you who write books on nonfiction definitely should read this. Last chapters on complicated subjects always disappoint. I had 3 pieces of advice. Number 1, read presidential history. It's so easy to do, and it's so instructive. Number 2, think transactional. Good, effective leaders. And finally, think about good or goodness, not in the banal sense, rather than greatness. Good in the sense that you are good, you are effective and competent. Good in the sense that you remain within the parameters of the law. Harry Truman once said Nixon may have read the Constitution, but he really didn't understand it. And good in the sense that you are emotionally intelligent. That's a fashionable word, but you know yourself. So you're not haunted by aspirations and demons which force you into courses of action which are bad for you. and the nation as a whole. I'm not a presidential historian. Margaret Warner, when I did a NewsHour show at Mount Vernon, which was really cool, said to me, why should anybody pay attention to what you think about the U.S. presidency? Actually, Lindsay's been asking me that question. It's 100% fair. It's a very fair question. Here's the answer. And my last point. The founders start this way. The word I and my is used twice in our Constitution. Does anybody know? Why would they use a personal pronoun in the Constitution of the United States? I is used twice, my is used once. Does anybody know why? Because they embedded the inaugural oath, Article 2, Section 1, Part 8, in the document. Now, why did they do this? I'm not sure. My interpretation would be this. It's not the presidency or the president that's the source of authority. It's us. We own this. It's the only national office we can all vote for, along with the vice president. It's a national conversation. We need to have it. That's why I wrote the book, and have fun having it, because it's educational, fascinating, and ultimately, I think, really, really good for the interests of the Republic. Thank you very much.
We're going to begin the question period. I want to do, Aaron, you may not be a presidential historian, but James Wilson once wrote a wonderful book called The Amateur Democrat, small d. And there's a place for the non-expert, non-professional to use one's own expertise to add some knowledge to the stuff we're dealing with. And that's what I felt as you were presenting today, and as I felt as you were reading. So I want to tell one story before we begin the question period. And it was stimulated by what you were saying, both about the Kennedy inauguration and your various references to FDR. In 1941, there was a night baseball game in the Polo Grounds between two teams that weren't going anywhere, the Giants and the old Boston Braves. But in those days, the night game began at 8 o'clock. And they postponed the start of the night game to broadcast over the Polo Grounds an FDR fireside chat in May of 1941, as we were preparing for the draft and other things. So imagine an audience listening in a baseball field to the president's fireside chat over the loudspeaker. That, in part.
Story. Truly.
So we're going to begin the question. We're videotaping this, and as you know, the question, everything's recorded, so people who aren't here can get the benefit of Aaron's talk and the conversation that will take place between you and him. So use the two microphones to ask your question, and since it's a public meeting, if you're comfortable, please give us your name, and we can begin. And I'm sure you haven't silenced us. Go ahead.
Hi, Mr. Miller. My name is Joel Margolis. My question is, do you believe the great American leaders in the past were born great, that they rose to greatness, or had greatness thrust upon them?
Well, that's the age-old debate. Cometh a man or woman, cometh the hour. I argue that the undeniables, Washington, Lincoln, and FDR, all were terribly ambitious individuals. I mean, Washington at the age of 23 was the single most important military leader in the entire state of Virginia. FDR ran for the New York State Assembly, mid-20s. Lincoln, who came from nowhere, a very successful railroad attorney, self-taught, self-schooled. They had ambition. They all, to a degree, exposed themselves to adversity or had that adversity thrust upon them, which I'm beginning to see adversity as a critically important piece of character formation. And finally, they knew how to do things. Now, whether that was because Lincoln had very little experience, FDR probably had the best resume since cousin Teddy ran for president. Washington had been a surveyor, a military leader. I think by and large they had the right character and capacity, and the crises which simply appeared, in which they were eager to put themselves in the middle of, created the alignment. It's very hard, I think, to game this out in a sort of scientific manner. All presidents to some extent are blind dates. We don't know who they really are. Despite their resumes, senators, obviously, we have some better sense. But I think it is the confluence of these things. And if I had to identify the factor that makes it possible more than any other, it is crisis. It was Teddy Roosevelt who lamented, did not have a nation-encumbering crisis, who literally said, had there been no Civil War, no one would have known Lincoln's name. Not known his name. And I think, Buchanan, best resume in the business. Herbert Hoover, incredibly professional. And yet neither could confront the two nation-encumbering crises that were about to break, or did in Hoover's case break. It's a recipe and a formula that I think is really hard to unpack. I would only point out that in the late 18th century, there were roughly 4 million people in this country, several hundred thousand slaves in an area perched precariously on the eastern seaboard with this huge continent yet to be explored. And yet, in a single generation or two, look what was produced. Madison, Adams, Thomas Paine, Jefferson, Washington, Monroe, you go on and on and on. Franklin, how was that possible? I don't know, and I don't think anyone will know. But it had a lot to do with the exigencies of the moment and the determination on the part of these three to be bigger and broader than themselves. They attached themselves, and Lincoln and FDR were incredibly partisan. One a partisan Republican and the other a partisan Democrat. And yet they harnessed that partisanship to something bigger, something more heroic, which was the American enterprise. I don't know. I don't doubt the patriotism, the loyalty, the competence of our modern day presidents, but I wonder to what degree experience really does serve to shape character. And I don't know the answer. You saw Ken Burns' The Roosevelts. Each of those three Roosevelts suffered according to different traumas and crises. Each were people of privilege, concerned theoretically only about the rights of the few. Why did they emerge to get into the business of protecting and caring for the rights of the many? I don't know the answer. But I do know, in our own contemporary politics, it's hard to figure out how to replicate or even recreate a modern day incarnation of those. I dismiss the notion that the best people, by the way, in this country do not run for the presidency. I think that is a let's take ourselves off the hook argument. And I've heard it all the time. The people who compete for the presidency want it. Many seem to be tough enough to face up to and to shoulder the responsibilities with the ego, the will, and to a large degree the narcissism that is required to pursue this relentless quest. It's self-selected. These are the people who sign up to be president. And, I don't think somehow, the Constitution's been amended 27 times in 260 years. One set came 10 in a row. The last time it was amended was 1992. We're not going to have another constitutional amendment that's going to somehow fix our political system. Term limits, a 6-year presidency. It's not mandatory voting. Many of these things might actually help. I don't believe it. We're stuck with the system we have, and we got to figure out how to demand more, but in some respects, be very sober and realistic. And we need to figure out a way to engage so we don't allow our own search for greatness to infantilize us and to assume that somehow, and within a year, you'll watch, within 1 year, particularly if Hillary Clinton decides to run, you will see it again. The Redeemer, the Savior. And I get it. I understand it. We want greatness. But you have to recognize and can't give up on your own sense of greatness in yourselves and in the nature of the country. Otherwise, it's impossible, I think, to hope and expect those qualities in someone else. And that's why followership is really, really, really important. And unfortunately, we've contracted a lot of our politics out to Aaron Sorkin for the West Wing, to our commentators on television, to a volunteer military. Absence of shared sacrifice, shared obligation, shared sense of responsibility, in my judgment, which I would argue is the single greatest challenge we face. Daughter Jen and I had a conversation when she was 21. She said, your grandparents had the Great Depression, World War II. You had the Civil Rights Movement, Vietnam, Watergate. What does my generation have? I couldn't answer. We talked around it. I couldn't answer the question. That question is the defining question. What set of national experiences that are common to us all and involve and encumber us in politics will help us invest? I don't know. Sorry, you dropped a nickel in me.
It's always good to listen to you. I was thumbing through your book last night and noticed several references to Clinton Rossiter. And I still think the American presidency is one of the best descriptions of how that job should be conducted. And in fact, told one of my neighbors I was going to buy her a copy this week. It's still in print. How do you think that the last two presidents have conducted themselves along Rossiter's descriptions of how the chief diplomat should conduct himself?
Well, Rossiter had a heroic vision of the presidency. And I mean, his sense of expectation was great, but he also had an uncanny ability to read reality. And I think you're right, by the way. I think that book is wonderful. I mean, look, when it comes to, you're talking about foreign policy now?
Oh yeah.
I mean, look, I am an Hegelian and not Chuck Hagel. I watch what's happened, and I served in part of the Bush administration, not in the Obama administration. But what I saw was a tendency to be risk ready in the wake of 9/11, a risk readiness that led to eventually the two longest wars in American history, for which the standard for victory was not could we win, but when could we leave. And we're not done. Clearly, we're now considering another kind of military approach to Iraq. I tried to put myself, I was driving to the State Department in the morning of 9/11. I couldn't imagine what a president and his closest advisors must have felt. Were we going to be attacked again? Was this it? What about September 12th? The initial response, I thought, was effective in Afghanistan. Intelligence, local allies, air power, and U.S. special operators. And within 3 months, those objectives were complete. And remember, we haven't been attacked again in 13 years, not a Al-Qaeda directed attack against the United States, inspired attacks, in which 25 Americans have been killed. How we could have gotten distracted and diverted into these, what I call, and not to trivialize anyone who served, certainly not those who died, and for whom the world will never be the same because of life-crushing injuries from which they will never recover. This was $1 trillion social science experiment to try to recreate in the heart of the Arab world with a fundamentally flawed policy some transformation. It failed. It truly failed. How pragmatic advisors who all served the first Bush 41, for whom I did work, could have seen the world this way without the kind of rigor, I don't know. Barack Obama, on the other hand, and this is the Hegel point, is a reaction. to the risk aversion of his predecessor. And his critics argue he's allowed the pendulum to swing the other way. He's become too risk averse. And again, I'm not betting on this, but the next president, whether it's a Democrat or a Republican, will try to split the difference between too much risk readiness in terms of the projection of American military power and even political power, and risk aversion, the so-called leading from behind, abdicating responsibility argument. Again, presidents are not free agents. They respond to circumstances, to exigencies, and their successors are not free to abandon the parameters set by the ones who went before. And that is why Barack Obama, in terms of national security, is, in my judgment, and he's disappointed many of his own constituents and his base, he is a much more disciplined and relentless form of national security protector than George W. Bush ever was. We've killed 10 times the numbers of prospective threats to the United States with Predator drones than W ever did. Guantanamo is still open. The National Security Agency is operating with an enormous amount of independence, even in the wake of the Snowden scandals. Doubled down in Afghanistan. He killed Osama bin Laden. He's dismantled Al-Qaeda Corps. And now, because of the emergence of ISIL, the Islamic State, he, in pursuit of protecting the homeland, which is the reason that he's doing all of this, he stayed out of Syria willfully for 3 years, despite the fact that it's the largest single refugee flow since the end of the Second World War, 200,000 dead and counting. None of that was enough. I agreed with him, and I continue to support that piece of the policy, as I do an intelligent, limited set of objectives in trying to preempt and prevent another attack on the United States. That is, you want to know what our primary foreign policy objective is in this country? It is the protection of the homeland. If you can't protect your homeland, you don't need a foreign policy. And that's what most Americans want, and that is why this man has chosen, against his better instincts, to begin involving himself in these wars. But it isn't to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. The next president, Democrat or Republican, will try to strike a balance between Bush 43 and Barack Obama.
Aaron, let me ask you. One of the things there's some wonderful nuggets in this book. I mean, you were talking about the Sorkin, the West Wing, yes. And Catherine Ashton, who is a leader of the EU and a major player on Iran negotiations, watched West Wing to learn more about the U.S.
Right.
That's in the book. That's the kind of nugget that's in the book. And so, but I want to ask you, you have a wonderful quote from Borston, Daniel Borston, about Americans are embarrassed by the charismatic presence.
Yes.
And at the same time, we're really arguing against greatness. We're really arguing against charismatic rescuer, leader, savior, all that. You even talk and discuss the importance of facilitation in leadership and getting to good. So reflect a little bit on that.
Thank you so much, because it's a theme I didn't really mention, and that is, despite our yearnings, we've had a tradition in this country since its inception, an ambivalence. Well, I reflected in the Russian Franklin comments. An ambivalence against great. The Europeans do great. Catherine the Great, Peter the Great, Charlemagne. No, seriously, we don't do great. And it's a tension here. The British ambassador was shocked when Thomas Jefferson opened up the door of the fact that he was opening up his own door was astounding. But the fact that he was dressed in his carpet slippers, the British ambassador went on and on. This was dismaying to him. Grover Cleveland was answering his own phone. When Bess and Harry Truman left the White House in 1953, and if you haven't read it, you should. It's called Harry Truman's Excellent Adventure. They got in a New York Chrysler that someone had given them as a gift. You ready? This was 1953. Everything would change 9 years later, or 10 years later after the Kennedy assassination. They got in the New York Chrysler, and they took a 1,200-mile road trip. Just the two of them. Harry got pulled over on the New Jersey Turnpike for a speeding ticket. They ate in diners. This is in part is what we want. We don't want the trappings and the convention of power. And this ambivalence, actually, do you have the book? There's a wonderful John Steinbeck quote. I mean, I can't read like my daughter because here it is. This is John Steinbeck writing in the early 60s. He captured the contradiction between the fact that we may be too ambivalent about greatness to actually appreciate it, but certainly we are ambivalent enough to love and blast our presidents at the same time. Here's what he said, quote, "We give the president more work than a man can do, more responsibility than a man should take, more pressure than a man can bear. We abuse him often and rarely praise him. We wear him out, use him up, eat him up. And with all this, Americans have a love for the president that goes beyond loyalty or party nationality. He is ours, and we exercise the right to destroy him." This ambivalence is deeply rooted because we are a nation of individuals, of independence. We don't like the notion, even while we want to be saved and redeemed, we don't like the whole notion. And that even makes this notion of greatness in the presidency even harder to appreciate. Again, I'm not a declinist. My involvement in the Middle East has really, that's what brought me to write this book. I look around at this broken, angry, dysfunctional region of the world, which will take generations to improve, and the fact that we're stuck in it. But then I look to us, and I really have a newfound appreciation, despite all of our imperfections, what an extraordinary place this really is. And I appreciate it more. I just think we have to look very realistically and soberly about what it is we can achieve and what our own past has led us to believe we could achieve. It was Niebuhr who said 50 years ago that, and he was talking about America, the best we can do, he said, is proximate solutions to insoluble problems. And frankly, that is the story of how we change. It took us 150 years to reconcile the promise contained in the Declaration of Independence with the reality that our own Constitution, without using the word, validated one of the largest single chattel slavery enterprises in human history. 150 years. And Ferguson tells me that we still have a ways to go in terms of the perceptions. Race still is a critically important unresolved issue in this country, but it's done in an evolutionary, gradual, incremental manner. We are evolutionary revolutionaries. And we have three natural advantages, which and I'll use the word and I'll defend it, but I just won't export it. We are truly exceptional. It is not for export, this exceptionalism. Number one is where we are. We have non-predatory neighbors to our north and south and fish to our east and west, what one brilliant historian called our liquid assets. If you want to understand American foreign policy, you must begin there. That's one of our, no other country in the world has this. None. When John Kerry says that Vladimir Putin is functioning and as if he were in a 19th century world when it's the 21st century, we freed ourselves from history and geography. Most countries in the world don't. Iran, China, Russia, Israel, the Palestinians, Egypt. They can't. We have been able to do it. It's a good thing. We just have to understand it may not apply to everyone. Second is our physical size and the abundance of our natural resources. It's hard for people who have not dealt with small powers, who perceive themselves to be living on the knife's edge, to understand what size and space actually mean psychologically. And finally is our political system. However inept, distorted, and imperfect it is remarkable because it is based on an idea, which is that individuals actually count. And by virtue of their luck, merit, success, timing, they can rise. That Barack Obama and Sarah Palin, and I use this line a lot, this is not, I'll preempt you, this is not an effort to trivialize either of them. But the fact that they both emerged in the same quote-unquote political time is a remarkable testament to the nature of our politics. We don't have a Republican candidate for president right now. Who will it be? It may well be another demonstration of this flexibility and openness in our system. Lincoln came from nowhere. Sorry, I love Chicago and I love Illinois, but then it was the hinterland. So this makes us exceptional, and this is why I think we really do need to have this discussion and wrangle with the issue of reconciling the system we have, well, reconciling the promise of what we want America to be with the way the country is now.
Aaron, thank you. You have